Yes, yes. Well, good morning again, Celebration Spiritual Center. It is so good to be with all of you. Just briefly, I just want to shout out all of our volunteers, Team Celebrate. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your love. Thank you for showing up early and setting up this space so that we're able to have service. Thank you so much. I also want to take a moment to say happy birthday to my baby girl, who turned 16 today. So shout out to Malcolm. So she will be with us during the holidays, so please send her love when you see her. So I want to move forward. We have an awesome month and an awesome topic. As you've heard, the series this month is The Greatest Gift, inspired by the short story and the classic movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And the topic is the cost of believing the ego. Now, just so I get a sense of the room, how many people have seen It's a Wonderful Life? Is it? Okay. If you haven't seen it, it's all good because it'll be on soon. For those of you who are old enough to remember, about 20, 30 years ago, it used to be on all day. Like throughout the Christmas holiday, you could turn on multiple channels and it was on. It's not the case anymore, right? But NBC always shows it at least 2 to 3 times in the season. So check your local listings because it'll help you as you're as we're going through this series. But so I might end up giving a few spoilers because we got to talk about it. But I think the impact in the movie will still be the same. And so in the beginning of the movie, we're introduced to this man who is in need of help. We have the conversation between 2 angels, Joseph and the angel Clarence, who is in need of his wings. And Joseph says to Clarence that at exactly 10:45 p.m. tonight, Earth time, this man, whose name is George, will be thinking seriously of throwing away God's greatest gift, that gift being his life. And so before Clarence can go to support George in making a new decision, he has to learn about his life. And so we're learning about the life of George Bailey at the same time. And we find out that George Bailey he's an amazing human, right? He's a good son, he's a good brother, he's a good employee. You all remember what he did by saving his employer from poisoning someone, right? He's patriotic. He's a big dreamer. He has huge dreams and goals. We find out later that he's a good husband, a good father. He's charismatic. Everybody loves George Bailey. We all love George Bailey. Yes, he's a great guy, right? And so one would wonder then, well, how in the world did he get to this place of wanting to commit suicide on Christmas Eve? He's a good guy. He's a good person and well-loved, and he has and holds all of the qualities that we consider to be good. And yet here he is in this moment. It sort of reminds me of the Job story, right? That in the Job story, he was considered a good man, had done nothing wrong in the eyes of God. And yet all of this affliction and all of this calamity and disaster came to his life. And so when we ask the question, how did this good man end up here? The question that I ask, which is always important when we understand how we ended up anywhere, is what was he believing about himself, his life, his impact on his family, his community, and the world at large? Because what I have come to understand is that how we respond or react to life, that's what tells us what we truly believe. And so as we see his response, this is giving us a clue to understand something about what he was believing. Now, before he ends up on this bridge considering suicide, contemplating suicide, there's a crisis. And y'all know what the crisis is, right? Uncle Billy lost the money for the deposit. He misplaced it and Mr. Potter took the money, right? We know the story. And everybody's searching, looking frantically to find this money. It's $8,000 that's needed. And eventually they don't find the money, and George Bailey, he gets very upset with Uncle Billy, right? And he says these words. He says, where's the money, you stupid, silly old fool? Where's the money? Do you realize what this means? It means bankruptcy and scandal and prison. He's upset because something has happened that could mean the demise of the business that his father founded. It could mean the destruction of the good name of his family. And so then George begins to unravel. And we find him, he goes home, and we meet his wife and his many children. And as George is beginning to unravel, we're actually getting to see what it is that he's really believing about life, about his life. And Mary asks him, "Did you have a hectic day?" And he says sarcastically, "Oh yeah, another big red letter day for the Baileys." That sarcasm is giving us a clue about what he really believes about life. Because see, what's interesting, we can get to the moment of crisis, but again, we have the opportunity to react or respond. And when we see our reactions, that's revealing our beliefs. So here he is in the moment of crisis, and this sarcasm is telling us something about how he believes the Baileys are perceived. Oh yeah, another big red letter day for the Baileys. In other words, he didn't believe that the Baileys were actually seen as a great family. He didn't believe that the Baileys achieved anything great. It goes further, and his son Pete begins to remark about the neighbors who just got a new car. Pete says, "Daddy, the Browns next door have a new car. You should see it." And George turns on him and says, "Well, what's the matter with our car? Isn't it good enough for you?" Unworthiness. What's interesting is these moments start to happen and they reveal what we really believe about life and about ourselves. Before Pete ever uttered the words innocently about the neighbor's new car, George already had a pattern of belief around his own worthiness, about what he can provide for his family and if he's good enough. And so this was now being outpictured in this conversation, in this moment of crisis. And further, as he begins to unravel, Mary asks again his wife, "George, what's wrong?" And he says, "Wrong? Everything's wrong. You call this a happy family? Why did we have to have all these kids?" Does it sound familiar? In the moment of crisis, we get to see what we really believe. Not as a point of judgment, but as a point of clarity. And so what was George Bailey believing? George Bailey was believing the ego. This idea, this statement, what's wrong? Everything is wrong. You call this a happy family? That's not the voice of love. Yes, there was a situation. There was a situation that $8,000 was needed. That's true. But did that one thing mean that everything was wrong? See, this is what the ego tells us. And so often we believe the voice of the ego. But the cost of believing the ego is to bring us to a place similar to where George Bailey ended up. Now, you may not want to take your life. It may not bring you to a bridge where you're contemplating suicide, but it brings you to a place of potentially wanting to do something that you would regret later. Potentially wanting to do something that would not benefit you in the long run. And so what is the ego? I think it's important that we understand this from the perspective of A Course in Miracles. In the workbook section of the Course in Miracles, there's a section called What is the Ego? And it says a few things that I want to share. Here we have, it says that the ego is idolatry. The sign of limited and separated self, born in a body, doomed to suffer and to end its life in death. The ego is the proof that strength is weak and love is fearful. Life is really death, and what opposes God alone is true. The ego is insane. In suffering for the price of faith in the ego, the price of faith in the ego is so immense that crucifixion of the Son of God is offered daily at its darkened shrine, and blood must flow before the altar where its sickly followers prepare to die. I want you to hear this again. Understand what the ego is, and we talk about the cost of believing the ego. Faith in the ego is so immense that crucifixion of the Son of God is offered daily at its darkened shrine, and blood must flow before the altar where its sickly followers prepare to die. This is the cost of believing the ego, of having faith in the ego. It entices us and woos us into our own destruction. We don't realize it because it feels true. We've all been in a crisis like George Bailey. You need $8,000, and this stupid, silly fool named Uncle Billy lost it. And he's going to mess everything up for everyone. What's wrong? Everything is wrong. Even this family is wrong. Even these beautiful children are wrong, and this marriage is wrong. And we find further in that scene, as George begins to unravel, what else happens? He finds out that Zuzu is sick. And when he finds out that Zuzu is sick, he's upset, and what does he do? He all but cusses out the teacher. Had that movie been made in 2017, he would have cussed out the teacher. Right? And then, of course, the teacher's husband gets on, and he goes in with him too. But there's something interesting that happens after that moment, because it's very climactic, and the room gets quiet and the music changes. There's something that George does as he finally unravels. He begins to destroy his drawing table and all of the buildings and the models that represented the dream that he had, that he did not allow himself to pursue. See, this is another clue that tells us what he was really believing. You silly fool, nothing ever works out for you. Why do you even have dreams? Why are you holding on to dreams? Don't you understand that you're just a failure? And so in that moment, the ego, as it says here in the text, the faith in the ego is so immense that crucifixion of the Son of God is offered daily at its darkened shrine, and blood must flow before the altar where its sickly followers prepare to die. This is the thing that would have you destroy your dream. This is what happens when we believe in the ego. Now, following that, he leaves because he realizes he's unraveling. He realizes he can't be here, and he's scaring the children. And he has another idea. Maybe I can go to Mr. Potter and figure out a way to get the money from him. And it's interesting because that scene with Mr. Potter, if you hear his words, it's the ego speaking to him. Because he asks for money, and Potter, of course, is very snarky and sarcastic. And he says, "Look at you. You used to be so cocky. You were going out to conquer the world. You once called me a warped, frustrated old man. But what are you but a warped, frustrated young man? A miserable little clerk crawling in here on your hands and knees, begging for help." That's the voice of the ego. Now, we say this all the time, but I think it's important to know, and it's beautiful when we can watch it in a story and in a movie like this. The voice of the ego is, as the text says, insane. Pastor Yolanda quotes this all the time. It is loud, shrieking, and it is always wrong. The voice of love would never, ever, ever say these words. "Look at you. You used to be so cocky. You were going to go out and conquer the world. You once called me a warped, frustrated old man, but what are you but a warped, frustrated young man?" You ever heard that voice within yourself? That voice that says, "Look at you. You messed up again. You thought you were all that. You thought you were this, that, and the other. Thought you were going to do something big. But where's your bigness now?" And if we're honest with ourselves, how many times have we believed that voice? The path that voice takes us is the same every single time. It brings us to destruction. It brings us to believing that strength is weak. As it says here, I love what it says here. The ego is proof that strength is weak and love is fearful. What it would look like maybe for many of us, believing the ego is proof that you shouldn't really have big dreams. That you really shouldn't aspire to be greater than what your mother or father did or had. That you shouldn't aspire to do something different than what you saw in your neighborhood. How dare you think that you could be, do, or have whatever you want? And so believing the ego becomes proof that you had no business thinking that you could become more than what you had seen. Am I talking to somebody in the room today? And so what is the remedy? Well, the remedy is twofold. It's self-forgiveness. And if you read in A Course in Miracles, actually this section, and it's the section that we're in right now in the workbook lessons, it's after describing what is the ego, then it's offering the remedy, and it's talking about forgiveness and seeing our own sinlessness and seeing the sinlessness of our brothers. That is part of the remedy. And I think we see that in George Bailey in a unique way, because the second part, what is the remedy? Contrast. And what do I mean by that? For those of you who study and know Abraham Hicks talks a lot about contrast, that how life works is many times by knowing what we don't want, that's how we come to know what we do want. Yes, yes? And so this is how the story of It's a Wonderful Life unfolds, because he wishes he was never born. And he has this conversation with Clarence, and he says, okay, and so it is. He got to see what he didn't want. He got to see what life would be like. He got the contrast. What would life be like if he never lived? And all of how everyone's life in his community and beyond were affected, because we recognize that he saved the life of his brother. And because his brother's life was saved, his brother was able to save the life of his fellow soldiers in the war. But because he wasn't there to save the life of his brother, all of those soldiers died as well. All of the houses and the beautiful community that wasn't built because he wasn't there. So he got to see contrast. This is why life, even the unwanted things in life, are a gift, because they point us to what we want. If you have something unwanted in your life right now, know that this is helping you to get clear about what you really want. And then what you must do, y'all know this because we talk about it in class all the time, then write it down. Everything that you don't want, you write it down first so that you're clear, and then turn the page or write on the other side. Now I know what I do want. In the case of George Bailey, of course, he recognized that more than anything, I want to live. It's interesting to me, too, because as he comes to himself, I believe it was sort of a forgiveness moment, right? He had to forgive himself to say, I want to live. Wait, I want to live. But he says something very interesting. Clarence, take me home. Take me home. I want to go home. It reminds me of the Wizard of Oz, right? It's that same idea all over again. These truths are so universal. Clarence, take me home. I want to go home. He had the ability to go home at any time. And in my imagination, I was talking to Pastor Yolanda about this. What I believe, I heard the beautiful teacher, Dr. Will Coleman, once talk about Moses' experience with the burning bush. And we know that in that experience with the burning bush, it says, and according to the story, that the bush wasn't consumed. It was burning, but it wasn't consumed. And Dr. Will Coleman says that it wasn't consumed because this whole experience took place in his mind. And what I realized, I said, this is really the same thing that was happening with George Bailey, and this is important for all of us. That in truth, probably this moment, because it was simply a thought of understanding what he didn't want, just imagining what would life be like if I wasn't here. He could walk himself through that. He didn't need Clarence for that. Clarence was the angel within him, right? We don't need Clarence to show up for us. We're going to talk about Clarence next week, because I love Clarence, right? But we recognize that Clarence represents a wisdom, a piece of wisdom within us. It takes place in our mind. And so in his mind's eye, he could entertain, just as we do with the work, the 4 questions. Who would you be without that thought? Just imagine for a second. You can entertain within your own mind's eye. What would life be like if I released this thought? Also with the question, how do I treat myself? How do I act? What things do I do when I believe the thought that I'm not worthy, that I don't matter, that life isn't good enough, that I don't have enough? Using our imagination within our own mind's eye, talking to the Clarence of our imagination, we can understand and see how life would be different if we weren't here. And by taking that journey within his own mind, he was clear. He said, take me back, Clarence. Take me out of this nightmare. I want to go back. I want to go home. Because it's interesting, and I'm almost done, y'all. It's interesting to me because let's just think about the problem. The problem was just that he needed $8,000. There are infinite ways that $8,000 could come to him. we see in the movie how more than $8,000 showed up easily and effortlessly because there were people that heard George was in trouble. That was all that was needed, right? Because people knew and loved George. Whatever, if George Bailey's in trouble, all the things that he's done for us, all the ways that he's helped us, people that wouldn't have a home if it wasn't for George Bailey, of course, right? It was really simple and easy. But when we're in that place of crisis and believing the ego, we don't have access to any of those ideas. So then we go ask the ego for help. He went to Potter, like the worst person to ask, because all Mr. Potter did was echo the voice of the ego. He didn't have access to affirming ideas. He didn't have access to prosperous ideas. He didn't have access to realize that he had the wealth of his entire community right there waiting for him to give him even more than he actually needed. But thankfully, he came to himself and said, Clarence, take me home. I want to go home. I woke up this morning with the lyrics of a song that I absolutely love. One day we're going to sing it here, but the title of the song is I Am What You See. And I love the lyrics of this song because this, I think, is the song, this is like a prayer that I think we must continue to pray over and over again because it's so easy to believe in the ego, to believe the voice of the ego. But we know the cost. We've all experienced and been on the brink of destruction, just like George Bailey was on the brink of destruction. But this song says this: help me to see me the way you see me. At times I see pain, Lord, when you see victory. I see where I am, Lord. You see where I shall be. Open my eyes. Help me believe. I am what you see. You see me victorious. You see me faithful. You see me believing that you are able. You see me rejoicing that I have survived. Open my eyes. Help me believe. I am what you see. There's a vantage point that is the God vantage point. So often we are only looking at our life from this limited vantage point of Uncle Billy did something wrong and we need $8,000. But the God in you, the God as you, sees you in victory. I love this line. It says, I see where I am, Lord. I see the circumstances of right now. I see the $8,000 that I need. I see Uncle Billy messed up. I see that my kid is playing that song on the piano over and over and it's getting on my nerves. I see that everything is wrong. I see that my dreams haven't been fulfilled yet. But the God in you sees where you shall be. Open my eyes. Help me believe. I am what you see. Course of Miracles puts it this way: I am as God created me. On that, I invite everybody to stand. It's a high price to pay to believe the voice of the ego. Right here and right now, we forgive ourselves and we set ourselves free. For any moment, any time, any second that we believe this lying voice, this voice that is only calling us to our destruction, this voice that is insane, this voice that is loud, shrieking, and wrong, we forgive ourselves and we set ourselves free right here and right now for any time that we believe this ego. We are so grateful and thankful to know that we have the opportunity to think a new thought. We have the opportunity to imagine another possibility. We have an opportunity within our own mind's eye to take ourselves on a journey and to see what life would be like if we continue to believe in the ego and what life would be like if we release that thought. So right here and right now, we ask the question, who would we be if we believed that we were worthy? Right here and right now, I ask the question, what would you be doing if you believed that you were holy? I ask the question, how would you see yourself walking through life if you knew that you were pre-approved? Who would you stop asking permission of? Which lovers would you stop begging to love you because you know that you are loved right here and now as you are? Where would you stop seeking approval? Where would you stop living some false idea of perfection and just be who you are with your holy, beautiful, worthy self? Who would you be if you knew that there was no ceiling on your good? What steps would you take? What people would you call? What job would you leave? What business would you begin? What things would you create? What albums would you record? What books would you write? What children would you have? What people would you teach? What places would you travel to? Where would you go? Where would you live? What homes would you purchase? What car would you drive? If you knew that you were worthy, I invite you in your mind's eye, because that is the only place where it exists, where it can exist and come into form, to entertain these ideas. Because you have the support of angels within you. You have the support of the vantage point of God that already sees you victorious. The greatest part of you already sees you winning. Mother, Father, God, we are so grateful and thankful for this possibility. We recognize right here and now, even in this moment, as we look at our country, we are seeing the cost of believing the ego. But I am so grateful to know that we collectively, within our own consciousness as a nation, have the opportunity to entertain a new thought, to understand and ask ourselves, who and what would we be in this nation without sexism, without misogyny, without homophobia? Who would we be? What kind of nation would we be? What type of leaders would we really be on this planet if we released these things and stopped believing in the voice of the ego? Stop believing this loud, shrieking voice. Who would we be without the thought of racism, without the thought of prejudice? Who would we be without the thought of separation? Who would we be without the thought of us versus them? Who would we be without the thought of rich versus poor? Who would we be if we decided to enact bills that benefited all people equally? Who would we be? I recognize and I stand clearly here and now, knowing that we collectively are the ones that must think this thought and bring it into being. We forgive ourselves and set ourselves free as a nation where we believe the voice of the ego no more. We let it go right here and right now. And we let truth come forward. We let love come forward. And we let go of fear. I release this prayer right here and right now back into the law. This law which is working with us and for us at all times and is good and only good. We let the good come forth. We let the good come forth. We let go and we allow. And for this truth and gratitude, together we lift up our voices and say amen. Amen. Ashe. And so it is. And so it is. Thank you, God. Thank you, God.